Hi. Okay, so this is our last video for the course. You know, I took a yoga class some time ago, and I was really inspired by the way they set up the class, and I decided to try to set up my philosophy courses in that way. The basic idea was that every pose that we did and everything that we did in the yoga class was all designed to set us up to be able to do this particularly difficult or challenging or complicated pose at the very end. And I remember I thought, well, that was kind of neat. I wonder if I could set up a philosophy course like that, where all of the texts are lined up in such a way that they all lead to students being able to really get a lot out of a final text. And in the case of this course, the final text that I chose was obviously Nick Sousanis' Unflattening, the first graphic novel that was ever accepted as a PhD dissertation. So I'm not going to have a lot to say about it, but because I really want to hear what you have to say, and I think you should read this one without too much undue influence by me. So, but I do want to have a few things to say about it. I just want to say one thing that connects to the course and one of the many things that I find most exciting about it. And then I'm going to have a few concluding remarks to make for the course, and that'll be it. So of all the concepts in unflattening, flatness itself, the line, borders, unflattening, the concept that's most exciting to me is the idea of the parallax view. Just this idea that not only is it the case that we can get at truth through combining multiple perspectives, but that we can, being open to other perspectives and encountering and engaging other perspectives is actually a kind of freedom, insofar as it's a freedom from self-determination. So on the one hand, you have this notion of freedom as I do what I want, I'm true to myself, what we called in the beginning of the course the freedom of Doug to remain true to himself. But there's also a sense that that freedom, that kind of self-determination can become a kind of cage. And that's a lot of what's going on in Unflattening. Just this notion that we get into these ruts, these particular ways of seeing the world, and on the basis of those particular ways of seeing the world, we develop our lives and the institutions of our society, and everything is sort of rooted in this particular way of seeing the world, which becomes a sort of trap. But maybe freedom is not just the freedom to be separated from the other, the freedom of autonomy, the freedom of Socrates to have his mind be free from his body, of Descartes to have his mind free from everyone, the freedom that the Quaker reformers were imagining when they dreamt up the punishment of incarceration, as the freedom of the prisoner to be free from all of the distractions of any sort of others, the sort of freedom of solitary confinement. But of course, we recognize that solitary confinement is also a kind of prison, obviously. Freedom then is perhaps less like the house that we retreat from the world into, and more like the doors and windows that we can have in that house through which we can engage with the rest of the world. But you know, we started off the course with this distinction between Doug and Mindy's definitions of freedom. For Doug, Doug represents the freedom of self-determination, and Mindy represents the freedom of open-mindedness. On one level, they're really in contrast to one another. It feels like we have to choose which one is really freedom. And for sure, I've generally been, I guess, taking the side of Mindy, and can sort of see the parallax view as the side of Mindy. That's the side of love in terms of Karen Warren, whereas Doug would represent the kind of certainty of arrogance. But maybe the ultimate parallax view on freedom, I'm thinking now, is that that freedom is actually this concept that can really only be fully appreciated if we have a kind of parallax view with respect to Doug and Mindy's perspectives. Doug has a point. When I think about somebody like Frederick Douglass, I think, wow, what was really awful about the slave situation is that they didn't have the freedom of self-determination. And so I can kind of see and fight for freedom from the other. On the other hand, I think about somebody like Descartes really taking that freedom from the other to an extreme, and he winds up all alone by himself. Sort of think about running away from a lion. I might see a cage from which I can protect myself from the lion as a kind of freedom, and it would be a kind of freedom. And then I get into the cage, and then imagine the lion's gone and I'm still locked in the cage. Likewise, I think that we're kind of pummeled on all sides with all these other people's perspectives, and so in the kind of impulse of Descartes, we might try to put everybody else's opinion to one side and come up with our own view on things. And that's a kind of freedom, for sure. A freedom from the heteros, a freedom of autonomy, a freedom from the other, a freedom to be oneself. And yet, then, like the cage and the lion, that can start to become a prison as well. So what I'm thinking is, and I don't know what this looks like, I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I'm thinking maybe rather than seeking a definition of freedom that would somehow or other encompass both the openness of a Mindy-like character and the closeness of a Doug-like character, maybe we can just think about freedom in this kind of parallax way, where just like in vision, I wouldn't say that my left eye is the truth versus my right eye having the truth. In fact, the parallax idea is that vision perception actually properly happens when I just take them both in, and maybe freedom is like that as well. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about Unflattening. It's an amazing project, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all come up with in your responses. The last thing that I would like to say about in the course is something about Star Trek, actually. So there's this political question. Is it possible that people can be bound together, that there can be a kind of love or a kind of bond between people that isn't rooted in their common hatred of some other group? I remember after September 11th, suddenly it was impossible to buy an American flag because everybody was buying them, because suddenly everybody in the United States seemed to feel really patriotic and really bound up with one another. And yet, you know, it seems like, okay, so now we all are bound together because of a common hatred. That's a love that has its root in hatred. And of course, we can see many episodes of that throughout history. The communists and the capitalists in the beginning of the 20th century hate each other, then they come together because they have the common enemy of the fascists, then they defeat the fascists, and so then they're fighting against each other once again. So the political question is there a love, a way that we can all be bound together other than through our common animosity towards some sort of enemy? Is there a sort of cooperation that doesn't have competition as its root? So Star Trek. There was the old Star Trek, and in the old Star Trek, the Klingons were the enemies. And I remember when I was in college that the next generation of Star Trek came out, and there was a Klingon on the deck of the ship, and I was sort of like, oh my God, don't trust that guy. And then I learned, oh, well, in the intervening years between the old generation of Star Trek that I grew up on and the next generation of Star Trek, that the Klingons and the Federation became joined together because of their common hatred of the new enemy, the Romulans. And so I learned to love the Klingons and hate the Romulans. Then the next iteration of Star Trek was Deep Space Nine. And in Deep Space Nine, there's a Romulan on the deck of the ship, and it's sort of like, no, don't trust that guy. And then you learn, oh, actually now the Romulans are friends with the Federation and the Klingons because they found a common enemy in the Borg. And so I learned to love the Romulans and hate the Borg. And then Voyager comes out, the final installment. And I remember before it started, I was sort of like, okay, I know what's going to happen. I know there's going to be a Borg on the deck of the ship, and I'm going to learn why the Borg are now our friend because there's some sort of new enemy. And I was kind of prepared for that. And of course, yes, there was a Borg on the deck of the ship. In fact, she was the captain of the ship. And I was sort of like, okay, fine, who's the new enemy? And they didn't go down that route. Instead, I think they really gave an interesting answer to this political question. Can there be a bond of love that isn't rooted in hatred? And the plot of Voyager wasn't that they were all together, united, because they had some sort of common enemy. In Voyager, the plot was they all were bound together because they were all lost. None of them knew where they were, and they all just wanted to get home. And so they were bound together in this kind of unknowing. What they all had in common wasn't hatred. What they all had in common was the humility of not knowing. And so I guess my final parting words for the course is this. I opened up the course like my first philosophy teacher opened up his course by saying that the difference between all of your philosophy courses and all of the rest of your courses is that in all of your other courses you go from uncertainty to certainty, whereas in a philosophy course you go from certainty to uncertainty. You come in knowing everything or thinking you know everything, the arrogance of thinking you know everything, and end the course realizing that you don't really know. And we tried to push that even further than Socrates. So, yeah, I hope that something like that has happened for you in this course. I hope that there are things that you used to be certain of that now you're not so certain of. I kind of wonder if that couldn't be a way forward for all of us. If we all just sort of stood back for a moment and realized that despite all of our differences, what we all have in common is that we all really don't know what exactly all of this is. We really don't know what's going on. I mean, all of the beliefs that we have, all of the ideologies that we're committed to and fighting for, we can just maybe take a moment to realize that they're just sort of our best guesses. And if we can be open to that, then maybe we'll be a little bit less dogmatic and a little bit more open, and maybe in that way we'll be a little bit more free. All right, well, thanks for hanging out with me this summer. I hope you enjoyed the course. I hope you got a lot out of it. I've learned a lot reading what you all have to say. And yeah, feel free to I'm looking forward to what you have to say about unflattening, and I'm looking forward to reading your final papers. Thanks for taking the course. And I'd love to hear in the future how all of this, what this course will come to mean for you as the years go on. Okay, bye now.